So we can hear from the state, appears to be Mr. Pearson.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
James Whitaker was murdered by the defendant, Michael Dixon. He was murdered. He was cut up, put in a burn pit, and burned over the course of a couple of days. Now, I'm not speaking hypothetically or anything like that. It was an actual burn pit with trash in it. That's what the defendant did to James Whitaker on or about July 3rd through July 25th of 2020. This is what the defendant did. Now, you may find this striking, may find this unbelievable, but these are the facts that happened on during this particular time. These are the actions of this man right here, the defendant, Michael Dixon. So how did we get here? How did we discover all of this? Well, we'll start with Diane Whitaker. Okay, that's James's mother. Okay, she would talk to her son often, usually every day. She would just make contact with her son, he would call her, and they would talk. Again, this happened just about every day. So then there came a point around July 3rd where she hadn't spoken to him. And the days progressed, and she didn't hear from James. She'd call him, leave voicemails, and she didn't hear from her son. So she began to get concerned. She contacted one of James's daughters. I think she contacted more than one, but we'll speak of one specifically, Julie Whitaker. And said, Julie, have you heard from your dad? I haven't heard from him. I haven't heard from him for days. Julie, being close with her father, tried to contact her father as well. Wasn't able to find him, wasn't able to make contact with him. The best she could do was leave voicemails on his phone indicating, hey, we're looking for you. Where are you? What's going on? Just like any concerned daughter would do. She got no response. At some point, the voicemail box became full. That also caused concern for Julie and Diane. Julie, who lived in Columbus, decided to come down to Hawken County and find out what happened to her dad. She decided to just go to his house and see if she could discover what happened to her dad. Where was he? Had he fled? Had something happened to him? Where was he? And she had trouble getting a ride down to Columbus at first, but then was able to get a ride down from Columbus at first, but then was able to get a ride. And came down from Columbus with some friends. You'll hear from some of them. Dustin Eveland is one of them. Keith Strickland is another one of them. They all knew James. And they go to James's house, and they discover the defendant there, Michael Dixon, and his daughter, Melody. She was about 18 at the time. And they get to this house where James had lived. And a little bit of backstory. Michael and Melody lived with James. Okay. Michael had moved in, I believe, a couple of years prior. And Melody had moved in with those two, James and the defendant, about 6 months prior. This wasn't a surprise. Everyone knew this. So, of course, Julie's going to ask Michael, where's my dad? Have you seen my dad? And Michael's answers did not satisfy her because he just indicated that he didn't know where he was. He didn't know where James was. He didn't know. Other people you'll hear ask Michael the same thing. They asked the defendant the same thing. Where is James? James was liked by a lot of people and he couldn't be located. And they knew that the defendant and his daughter lived with James, so it would be, routine or obvious that the defendant would know where James was. But the defendant just said he didn't know. He didn't know where he was. Again, so Julie and her friends are in Hawken County at James's house. Melody and the defendant are there, being sketchy, not giving complete answers. Julie said she's calling the police. She's had enough. This is too weird. The defendant's being suspect. It's being weird about it. She's calling the police. No James in sight. So she calls the police. And she starts to notice that she's there for a while, and she's looking around. She noticed some of her dad's things are gone. Mainly this large TV that her dad had was gone. When she approaches the defendant, she's like, "Where is that TV? Like, what did you do with my dad's stuff?" And the defendant didn't give a good answer, didn't give a clear answer, didn't talk about anything else, said he didn't know. And at some point, the defendant and his daughter hightail it out of there. Maybe it was because Juliet said she called the police. Who knows? But the defendant and his daughter hightail it out of there. They leave. Officer Champ was called. He was one of the first responding officers to arrive on the scene. And he talks to Julie and the other individuals about why they're there, why they called, where James is. And then that's when it starts. That's when the investigation starts about what happened to James Whitaker. The investigation progressed over a number of days and weeks, interviewing multiple people. Forensics were involved. DNA experts were involved. And they began to search the property, search for James Whitaker. And as you will hear over the course of these next few days, you will hear what the evidence of this investigation were. You'll hear that Michael Dixon, the defendant, killed James Whitaker. You will hear that he cut up his body, that he used heavy instruments, blunt force instruments, to break down his bones. You'll hear that he put James Whitaker in a burn pile with other trash and burned him over the course of days. You will hear that he put accelerant like gasoline and lighter fluid and stuff and tires, because tires burn for a long time, on top of James's body and his remains. You will hear that the defendant used a rake and kind of raked up the remains to keep it going, to keep the fire going, to decompose his body so that he would not be caught for killing James Whitaker. You'll find that law enforcement had to call in an anthropologist. You'll hear from her. An anthropologist, like, the ones who look at dinosaur bones and ancient ruins to determine the origin of things. Because that's how decomposed, that's how much the defendant tried to hide what he did. The anthropologist is going to tell you a few things. She's going to tell you that James Whitaker's bones were broken, they were cut up, that those cuts happened before he was burned. And you will also hear that there were guns involved, that the defendant shot and killed James Whitaker, shot and killed him before trying to cover up his body. You'll hear that the defendant sold those guns that were used to kill James Whitaker to cover up his tracks. He sold them and got rid of them. You're also going to hear that the defendant had help in covering up his killing of James Whitaker. He enlisted the help of his daughter and other people to cover up the killing of James Whitaker. They helped him prevent discovery of the body and himself as a defendant in actually killing James Whitaker. And ladies and gentlemen, the state's going to ask you to find the defendant guilty of some charges, because the facts support every single charge against the defendant. So we're going to ask you to find the defendant guilty of some charges. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the charges right now, because as you heard at the end of this case, the judge is going to give you jury instructions. It's going to be a fair amount of pages on the law and the crimes against the defendant. It's going to have all of the elements and all of the things you need to consider to find the defendant guilty of all of these charges. And many of you may not know how a trial progresses, but I'll just give you a snapshot of that. Is that Joel and I during the prosecution of this case, are going to call witnesses. They're going to sit on the stand and they're going to tell you what they know about this case and the situation that led to the defendant killing James Whitaker. Now, just like in most criminal cases, there's not one witness that's going to tell you from beginning to end what happened. They're going to give a snapshot of what they saw. Maybe they didn't even know it was criminal at the time. Maybe they don't know how it fits in the grand scheme of things. But they're going to give you their portion of what they know about this particular case. Some of those witnesses will give testimony about more than one charge. Some witnesses may just give a short testimony about one particular charge or more than one particular charge. It just depends on the witness. But again, not in most criminal trials, you don't have a witness talking from beginning to end about it. So we're going to need your time and your attention about who they are and what they saw and what they witnessed. At the end, the state is going to ask you to find the defendant guilty of murder, amongst other things. But I'll just hit the main ones here, because again, you're going to have those jury instructions. But we'll start with murder. Murder is going to be defined in part as purposefully killing another person. The purposeful killing of another person, meaning that the defendant didn't murder James Whitaker by accident. He didn't accidentally trip and shoot him. The defendant intentionally and purposefully killed James Whitaker. We're also going to be asking you to find the defendant guilty of a different type of murder. It's often called felony murder, meaning that in the commission of a felony, someone dies, you're blamable. You're responsible for that. Now, there are going to be 2 counts of murder, but we're not talking about 2 victims. We're just talking about 2 ways that the defendant may have killed James Whitaker. Purposeful and or through felony murder, through commission of a felony. And that felony, that underlying felony, is felonious assault. That's defined as causing serious physical harm to someone or causing harm with a deadly weapon. Shooting someone, that's serious physical harm. Using a gun to shoot someone, that is a deadly weapon. You will be asked to find the defendant guilty of both of those. You don't have to choose one or the other. The law is very clear. The judge will instruct you on that. You don't have to choose one or the other. We're asking that you find him guilty of both because he did both. He purposefully caused the death of James Whitaker and also caused the death of James Whitaker by shooting him, which is the felonious assault. We're also going to ask that you find him guilty of gun specifications. And again, the judge is going to define all this, but essentially that the defendant used a gun to commit these crimes. We're going to ask you to find the defendant guilty of tampering with evidence. That's basically what it sounds like. There's evidence of the commission of a crime and you tamper with it, you hide it, you get rid of it, you destroy it to prevent you from being caught, you or someone else from being caught. You're guilty of tampering with evidence. That's what the defendant did by attempting to get rid of all trace of James Whitaker, by selling his property, by lying to authorities. All of these things can be considered tampering with evidence, getting rid of evidence of the commission of a crime. Additionally, we're going to ask you to find the defendant guilty for his role with other people, that he was with other people and they worked together to prevent the discovery of the death of James Whitaker. Other people did other crimes as well. Now, the defendant is the only one on trial here, but you can certainly consider there are other acts for this particular charge and the other crimes that other people did to prevent law enforcement from finding out that this man, the defendant, killed James Whitaker. And we're going to ask you to find him guilty on those charges. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no simple case in my years as a prosecutor, but this is a very direct case. This case is very direct. And you have heard in voir dire about self-defense. And let me just cut straight to the chase and get down to the bottom of it so you're all aware of where this originated from. So you see, as I've said, Michael Dixon told many lies to many different people. He told lies to friends and family members of James Whitaker. He told lies to law enforcement. He told lie after lie, lie on top of lies. At first, he said he didn't know where James Whitaker was. And you're going to hear about these. You're going to hear about it from his mouth. He told lie after lie. First, he said he didn't know where James Whitaker was. Then he said he may have gone away. He may have committed suicide. Then he says that, oh, yeah, there was a struggle over the gun. And the gun must have went off and shot James Whitaker. But see, law enforcement doesn't just go off of someone's word, right? They do a thing called an investigation. And so when they're investigating this, they take his lies and they investigate this. They go back to the defendant and like, hey, what you're saying just doesn't add up. Why don't you tell us the real truth? Because what you're telling us is a lie. The defendant kept going. And at some point he says that he was protecting his daughter, Melody. And that James was threatening Melody, so therefore he had to kill James. So that's where that lie of a self-defense comes from. And the state's going to show that there is absolutely zero evidence besides his own self-serving lie that it was self-defense in the manner in which he killed James Whitaker. Now, again, we're going to present witnesses, and over the course of the next few days, you're going to find out. Evidence will be presented that Michael Dixon, the defendant, killed James Whitaker. The defendant took James's property after he killed him and sold it to other people. The defendant took the murder weapon and got rid of it to prevent apprehension and discovery of what he did. The defendant cut up James Whitaker's body and used instruments to break down his bones and put him in a burn pit. The defendant put gas and accelerant and tires and things on this burn pit so that the body of James Whitaker would never be found. The defendant went through that pile, picked out teeth and other remains that didn't decompose and weren't burned up to discard them so they would not later be discovered. And when anyone asked him about this, the defendant just told lies. Just told lies until he was confronted with the truth by law enforcement. So again, when you have all of the evidence, when you go back into the jury room, the state will be asking you to find the defendant guilty and hold him responsible for the killing of James Whitaker. Thank you.